Good morning. Good morning. There we go. Power. During the sermon, I was like, wow, that's loud. Talk softer. We are in Luke chapter 22. Last week we discussed Peter's denial of Jesus. This morning we're going to look at the trials of Jesus. Now, throughout the text, if we were to put everything together, there are 6 trials in two different segments of 3. There are 3 religious trials. There are 3 political or civil trials. The first 3 religious trials happened, one before Annas, and then the former high priest, and then Caiaphas, the current high priest, and then the Sanhedrin council. We're only given 2 here by Luke in his account, and I think there's probably several reasons for that, but needless to say, he's condensing some of this and getting to the point of what's happening here. I think part of this, in my judgment, as I've looked at some of the different accounts, is Luke is particularly focused on just showing because again, he's writing to a primarily Gentile audience, maybe even a Roman audience, and he's trying to focus, one, on the accusations of the Jews and the governmental leaders' response to that, and then get to the main point, which is the sacrifice of Jesus. Okay? But there are 6 trials in all, and there are 2 listed for us here. Now, there are several problems with these Jewish trials. Number one, there was not to be any trial held during a feast time. Well, this is the Festival of Booths, or Tabernacles. It is almost Passover. At the end of that week of that festival, there are not to be any trials during this period of time, but yet they seize upon this opportunity with so many Jews in Jerusalem at this time to address this issue once and for all. They're not supposed to. Number 2, each individual member of the Sanhedrin was supposed to have an individual vote to either convict or acquit. But Jesus was simply convicted by an acclamation. They just said he was guilty. There was no private vote, the individual vote. Number 3, if the death penalty was assessed at a trial, according to Jewish law, there had to be another night pass before sentence could be carried out. Well, what we have here is a sentence being handed down and it being executed within hours of the pronouncement of guilt. The Jews had no authority to execute anyone. In Judea, they were still under Roman rule, and only the Roman law could execute anyone. And they, as we'll see, they play to that here in a moment. Number 5, no trial was to be held at night. Well, the first 2 trials are held when? Before the rooster crows, before sunup. And it's not until the next day when the Sanhedrin meets after sunup. And lastly, the accused number 6, the accused was supposed to be given representation. Jesus had no representation. And I think in part it's why he doesn't really respond. Not only is it a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that as a lamb before the shearer he will remain silent, he has no counsel there, and he's not really authorized to represent himself. And then lastly, it was against the Jewish law for the accused to be asked any self-incriminating questions. But is Jesus asked any self-incriminating questions in these trials? Well, sure he is. All right. So let's jump in here. We're in Luke chapter 22. We're going to look beginning at verse 63. Luke 22, 63. And hopefully we'll get through all of these this morning. We'll see how far we get. Verse 63, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody, now this would have been after the high priest had, at least Annas, the former high priest, probably after both. The men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. Now, the word mocking here literally means to dance around someone, beating them or antagonizing them. And we used to, my sister's 4 years younger than me, we used to mock her and we were brutal. My brother and I were brutal, and she would make him stop constantly. I can't imagine the mockery of Jesus. Even on the cross, we're going to see that many walked by wagging their heads and mocking him. And I just how ugly and childish and blasphemous. And it says here, they were saying things that were blaspheming. The word blaspheming here in this sense means to insult. They were just tormenting him, insulting him, belittling him, slapping him, spitting upon him, punching him. But what was Jesus' response? What does Peter say? Peter said when he was reviled, he reviled not again. He didn't respond in kind. Again, Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7 says he was silent before his abusers. How many of us would be silent before our abusers? Or how many of us would let the old person come out? And we'll talk about this later too when we get to the cross, and I've mentioned this before. Did Jesus go to the cross willingly? I think he probably did. I mean, he didn't want to, obviously, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. In the garden, what did he want? Man, if anything else, let this cup pass from me. If there be any other way, but not my will, but thine be done. And I believe when he left the garden that night, he went on willingly. Now, if they were going to take you or I and nail us to a cross, how would we go? There's going to be a fight. There is. But I can't help but believe that Jesus simply laid down and stretched out his arms. Isn't that what it says? And here, I mean, the restraint that Jesus shows. What are your thoughts, comments on this? What do you think? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes when we're, and you use the word conviction. When we're truly convicted of something and know that what we're doing is the right thing to do, what can we endure? And I think that's kind of what's going on here. Now, I think the older that I get, the easier it is to let those things go and to be more convicted. Maybe I'm not as proud and arrogant as I was when I was younger. Hopefully not. But still, the restraint that he shows. The natural inclination to me would be to defend myself, to answer back anyway. And man, if anybody had the power to answer back in a great way, even on the cross, he could have, somebody finish it, called 10,000 angels. When they were mocking him and said, if you be the Christ, come down, what would we have done? Show you.
We've all done things that are wrong and realize we have to face the consequences of that. We generally just resign ourselves and I'm going to have to do it. But Jesus had to do it.
But when you haven't done something wrong and you're accused, harder. Well, and that's a good point. Now, that made me go back to think about something that Bonnie said. Almost said something Bon said. Sorry. That's what her grandkids call her. That's okay, right? All right. Did Jesus know why he was doing what he was doing? Did he know what was going to happen? And why it was going to happen? Did that make a difference? When you know that you're doing God's will, and when you know the outcome, does it make it easier to withstand the trial? And in his case, man, the ultimate why and the ultimate stand, even though he was not guilty of what they were accusing him of. Most, right. Anybody else?
I think that has to get through his whole life. The temptation.
Absolutely. From Matthew chapter 4 on, when Satan is tempting him, 40 days of being without food and water, and you're near death, and all you can think about. Well, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, Tim. I finished watching Band of Brothers. When they free the Jewish concentration camp, and those people are starving, and they bring food in, and what are these? The doctor eventually comes in and says, you got to stop giving them food. Why? They'll eat themselves to death. You imagine how hungry Christ was. And Satan says, all you got to do is change the stone into bread. But from that point, throughout his entire life, what helped him? And time again, we're told, and we've noticed this through our study of Luke, they try to take him, but he gets away. Why? Because his time was not yet. And even before this festival, remember a few weeks ago we talked about his brothers didn't believe in him, and they said, if you are who you say you are, if you're doing the things that you say you can do, go up to Jerusalem and prove it. And Jesus says, I'm not going up with you, it's not time yet. But when it was time, what did he do? He went. Did he know what was waiting for him? Would we have went? We ain't there yet. we probably would have went the other direction, right? Or we wouldn't went anywhere at all. We'd just stay put. All right, verse 66. When it was day, the council, or the Sanhedrin, so now it's day. So they haven't, the first two trials that they've had before Annas and Caiaphas, these aren't legal trials. He should not have been tried at all. But now it's daytime, and they bring the council, the Sanhedrin, to the people, and they assemble together both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated on the right hand of the power of God." Did Jesus know what was going to happen? Again, as Janice, he knows, right? Verse 69, he knows where he's going. He knows what's about to happen. And they say to him, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he answered and said to them, or he said to them, now, let my Greek geek come out here in a second. All right. But what does your translation say? How does he answer? Different translations are going to translate what is said here differently. Now, I'll tell you, the New American Standard says, "Yes, I am." Not a real accurate conveyance of what the Greek says. I'll just tell you that. What else does your translation say? Ye say that I am. Anybody else?
Say that I am.
What I'm saying? You rightly say that I am. Anybody else? Does Jesus confess here like the New American Standard says? "Yes, I am." No. The Greek literally says, "And to them he said, you are saying I am." So what does that mean? What do you think? They said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said, "You are saying that I am." Is that confusing? And that's exactly why he's saying it that way.
I think it's interesting they say that you're the son, you say that you're the Son of God. He said, "If I say that I am," then if they don't believe that he is.
And I think that's part of it. He's saying what you're saying and why you have me here. Has he said anything else up to this point? The only thing he has said is what? Well, from this point forward, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of God. So he's appropriating language from Psalm 101, a Davidic psalm of sonship. And so he's saying to them, your accusation is that then I am the Son of God. Is that right? And because he doesn't just flat out deny it, their response is, and we've heard it from your own mouth, if you won't deny it, then you say you are. He's not incriminating himself. Again, remember, one of the laws, of the Jewish laws of trial, is that he could not be asked a self-incriminating question. But he is. And so he puts, as he always does, he puts it back on them, and they condemn him.
The mission had to be completed.
Mm-hmm.
So, him outright admitting who he was, it wouldn't have changed. In human terms, they could have altered the mission.
Yes.
God would have seen it through.
Right.
But
Yes.
you see the mind psychology there.
I think so.
You know, some of them might have backed off of more crucifying
True.
if they would have, at that moment, truly believed that.
He's letting them, okay, so
Explain what I mean. I can't explain what I mean.
is there, okay, let me do it this way. Is there any real difference between what he's trying to get from them and what he tries to get from us? Our acceptance or denial of Jesus is based strictly on what? A choice based on faith. What's Jesus asking them to do? Have faith to either believe based upon what the prophets have said and what he has already shown, what they've seen and what they've heard, or not. If he just flat out says, I am he, then he's not allowing them to be moved by faith, but by a command. And I think that's part of it. And I think that's kind of what you were getting at there, is part of God's plan is that people respond in faith to what God says and does.
It was going to all happen whether they
Sure.
believed or not.
Right.
He also said, verse 6 and 7, he said, if I tell you, you will not believe.
That's right.
So,
So what good's it going to do to say I am? Again, the only thing that will convince them is faith in what the prophets have already said and what he has already shown and done. And if they're not going to believe that, if he tells them, they're not going to believe that.
they had no intentions,
Oh,
of doing what was right or believing in him or anything. They came there to kill him.
and that's it. They had one intent, and all they're trying to do is find some justification. That's all they're trying to do. And we see that as we go on here, because the further this goes, what happens to their attitude, their demeanor? It gets worse and worse. Their anger grows higher and higher, hotter and hotter. Let's go on. So, chapter 23, verse 1. The whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. So now it goes from a religious to a civil or criminal case. And they bring him to Pilate because they don't have the power to do what? What do they want to do? They want to kill him. They want to be rid of him once and for all. They don't care why. And so when they bring him to Pilate to try to get their sentence of death carried out by the Romans, and this is exactly what Peter says in Acts chapter 2. For all of those years ago who threw such a fit when Mel Gibson came out with the Passion of Christ and everybody was, well, he's blaming the Jews and he's blaming... Well, what does Peter say? Peter said, you did it and the government did it. And oh, by the way, it was God's plan all along anyhow. Back to what you said. God's plan was going to be carried out. But the Jews were guilty of putting Christ to death. So were the Romans. They were guilty. But the reality is, we're all guilty. I'm responsible for putting Christ on the cross. My sin put him there. So I'm just as responsible as those who actually drove the spikes through his hands, those who condemned him that day. I'm just as responsible as any of them, Travis. So who's guilty? But when they bring him to Pilate, verse 2, there's 3 charges that they lay against him. Number 1, we found this man misleading our nation. He is subverting Israel. He is causing insurrection. He is teaching against our laws. He's upsetting our way of life. Well, what's Pilate going to do with this charge? Well, if this is about your laws and your thing, you see to it. So, charge number 2, he's forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Now, again, what we're getting here in verse 2 is a truncated narrative of what happened that day. All right? They didn't just go to him and say 1, 2, and 3, and, you know, there's a debate going on. There's a trial going on. So, the first accusation is he's subverting Israel. And Pilate's like, if this is about your laws and your religion, you see to it. I ain't got no jurisdiction over that. You do it. Well, he's saying they shouldn't pay taxes. What's the response to that? Has Jesus paid taxes? Absolutely he has. Has he commanded his followers, his disciples, to pay taxes. Sure he has. What has he always told them? Give that unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give unto God what is God's. Pay your taxes. And they could prove it. There were plenty of Matthews running around Judea, collecting taxes from people. And do you think they kept records? You better believe they kept records. Because if you didn't pay your taxes, what did they do? They'd get you one way or another. I mean, just like today, I guess, right? The IRS coming for you. They kept records. Was it easy enough to find out whether Jesus and his disciples were paying taxes? Well, so that argument falls flat. So number 3. He is saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now what are they doing? They're pitting him against Caesar. So Pilate asked Jesus. Notice, he doesn't ask Jesus about insurrection. He doesn't ask Jesus about paying taxes. When he hears this last accusation, he looks at Jesus and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, again, the Greek is rather ambiguous here. And basically he says, "You're saying it." It's almost the same thing he said before to the Sanhedrin. Now, in my translation, he says, "You are saying it," but "you are saying" is in italics, so that the translators have added that. So literally it just says, "You say." It is as you say, you say. That the translators are trying to explain this ambiguous Greek phrase. Okay. But again, it goes back to Jesus is just given this ambiguous, you're saying it. He's not affirming or denying. Either way. He's letting the people make the decision. He's not forcing anybody's hand here. Does he force our hand to obey or not? Does he give us the free will to choose either in faith to accept or not? Yes. And he's doing the same thing here with them. So Pilate, verse 4, concludes what? What's he guilty of? So what? He says he's the king of the Jews. How many people claim to be the king of the Jews? Herod himself wanted to be proclaimed the king. Herod the Great wanted to be. And we're going to get to Herod Antipas here in a second. And he's the son of Herod the Great. And he considered himself king of Galilee, roughly, right? Galilee and Perea. Pilate's saying he's not a threat to Caesar. He's got no army. He doesn't have a great following of political activists. And he's just this itinerant preacher who's claiming to be the Messiah, the promised one. Does Pilate care? No. But they kept on insisting. So it's like how many of us have kids that threw fits? But right? I mean, this is what they're doing. He says, there's no guilt, but he's stirring up the people. He's teaching all over Judea. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here, and he's bothering us, and we want to get rid of him. I don't care. Pilate don't care less. In fact, when he sees that Jesus began in Galilee, he sees an out. What's his out? Well, Herod just happens to be in the city. And Herod is the king of Galilee. He's the ruler of Galilee. And he's a converted Jew. He's an Idumean who became a Jew, and they rule this Herodic family rules over Judea. They have this relationship with Rome. Rome kind of lets them do their thing. As long as Rome's getting their taxes, they don't care. And so Pilate, when he hears, verse 6, asked, is this man a Galilean? And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was in Jerusalem at that time. Now Herod was very glad to see Jesus. Why? Well, he had wanted to see him for a very long time. Keep your finger there. Turn back. I don't know if you'll remember this because it was like months and months and months ago. Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verse 7. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all the things that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead. Well, who had killed John? Herod had. Herod had beheaded him. Same Herod, Herod Antipas, he had beheaded him. Why? Because he was married to his brother Philip's wife, and John the Baptist told him, you got no right to be married to her, and so off with his head. All right? And now he's hearing that John the Baptist has come back from the dead, and he's like, I want to check this out. But some were saying that it was Elijah, but others one of the prophets of old. And Herod said, I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things? And he kept trying to see him. Herod had been wanting to see him for a while. So when Herod's in the city and he hears that Pilate's going to send Jesus over, he's, wow, I'm finally going to get to see this guy. Right? And he had wanted to see him for a long time, and not only that, he'd been hearing these things, and he hoped to see what? Some sign, some miracle. We got people like this running around today. I just want to see Jesus work a miracle in my life. Just do what he says. I mean, these people saw miracle after miracle after miracle. They didn't believe. Again, it's not the miracle that he wants you to believe in. It's faith in his word, in his teaching that he wants you to believe in. So anyway, he comes to him hoping that he would see some miracle or sign performed by Jesus. And he questioned him at some length. And again, Jesus answered nothing. Does Herod really want to know? Will he, and we'll talk about this next hour a little bit when we look at John chapter 9, and Jesus heals a blind man there in John chapter 9. If he tells Herod, if he says, will Herod believe? Will Herod also become a disciple? No. Does Jesus know that? Yes. And so again, Isaiah 53:7, Acts chapter 8, he stands before him silent. And the chief priests and scribes are standing there accusing him. What's your text say? Mine says vehemently. They just were. Again, that anger level, that frustration is rising and rising. But, Herod's got no power over this. Herod can't have him put to death. And they just keep on and on. So Herod's got no choice but to do what? Well, he's got one other thing he can do. He puts a robe on him. They make fun of him, and they belittle him, and they berate him, and then sends him back to Pilate. And interesting, verse 12, Herod and Pilate became good friends. I have no idea. That's one of those scriptures I'm like, why does God see fit to tell us that this made Pilate and Herod BFFs? I don't get it, but they did. Because before that day they were enemies with each other. I guess even Jesus can bring enemies together. Right? Bill, I don't know what else. Verse 13. So Pilate summons the chief priests and the rulers of the people and says to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before, I found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. Nor has Herod. For he sent him back to us, beholding nothing deserving of death has been done by him. So, I'll punish him and release him. Why? Because there was this obligation he had to release a prisoner during the feast. And so he says, I'll beat him, I'll scold him, punish him for whatever, and maybe that'll shut him up and I'll release him. Remember also, and again, Luke doesn't share this with us, what's Pilate's wife tell Pilate? I kind of think, and I may be wrong here, but I kind of think that this happens between the first trial with Pilate and the second. Jesus is brought to him, he sends him off to Herod, and then Pilate's wife has this dream and tells him, and when he comes back, Pilate's like, So what's Pilate do? Matthew 27 verse 24 says he does what? He washes his hands of it. Now Luke doesn't share that with us. But Matthew says he calls for a basin of water, he washes his hands, like symbolically saying, I'm free from this man's blood, right? But is it that easy? Who has the power to release him or kill him? Pilate alone. And washing his hands of it, and this is where we get this idea of, well, I'm just going to wash my hands of the whole thing. I'm not going to take responsibility. But when you say that, what are you ultimately doing? You're allowing to happen what you had the power to stop. So we can't just wash our hands of things that we're responsible for. We have to stand up and do what we're responsible to do. Pilate wasn't willing to do that. So he's going to release somebody. But verse 18. But they cried out all together, saying, away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. How ironic. What were they accusing Jesus of? Insurrection. Stirring up the people. Calling himself a king. And stirring up the people against not pay taxes to Rome and making himself a king over Caesar. Kill him. Oh, by the way, the guy who actually caused insurrection and tried to overthrow Rome, let him go free. Make any sense? What does anger and sin cause us to do? Lose our minds. Right? What happens in Luke 15 with the prodigal son? Doesn't he lose the proper function of his mind when he's off in the world sinning? He ends up in the pigsty. And then the text says he came to himself. The light bulb went off and he started thinking straight again. What does anger and sin cause us to do? Lose the proper function of our minds. Crucify him, verse 21. And he said to them the third time, and I think this is a good question to ask ourselves when we're not being obedient or faithful to the Lord. Why? What has he done? Why would we not do what he has asked us to do? What evil has this man done? I have found no guilt demanding of death, therefore I'll punish him and release him. But they were insistent and with loud voices asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. So Pilate washes his hands and pronounces the sentence that their demands be granted. And he released the man that they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But he delivered Jesus to their will. Can we be guilty of crucifying the Lord afresh, anew, again? How? The thing that I think that strikes me, I guess there's several things. We just got a couple minutes. What strikes you about this whole narrative? I think we've already touched on a couple of the things. I think one of them is, again, Bonnie, the commitment of Jesus. The conviction, the commitment, knowing that this is the Lord's will. This is the Father's will, and he's okay with that. The irrational mind of the people. It just doesn't make sense, right? And to ask for Barabbas at the end and Pilate's indifference to the whole thing as the one who had the ability to do something about it. But ultimately, I think just to see that all of this is happening because it is the Father's plan to save me from myself. All of this that we just read, that we just looked at, and what we're going to study next week, looking at the crucifixion itself, happened because of me. I need to see myself in this story. Go ahead, Phil.
The song we sing, Tell Me the Story of Jesus. Toward the end of that song, love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see.
Yeah. When we read passages like this and really look at what's going on here and why, it ought to move us. Anybody else?